Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we have the great zchut of reading Parshat Emor. Parshat Emor, not the majority, but a significant part of Parshat Emor is devoted to something we normally call Parshat HaMoadim, right? The description of every single holiday, starting with Pesach, going through Shavuot, then Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. Right, that's a description of the holidays. It's not really the Karbanot. The Karbanot are found in Pinchas, as we know from all the Haftorahs of the Yom Tovim. But the mitzvos of the holidays are found in Emor. And it strikes me, given that we're 2+ weeks out from Chag Shavuot, that we should devote whatever time we have today to the holiday of Shavuot, the connection of Shavuot, how we get there, various issues relating to Shavuot. And I want to start with the Ramban. That, well, it's hard to get through it, to be honest with you, and most of it is Kabbalistic, but I want to read the beginning of it because I think the Ramban is touching on a really, really significant point, and that's sort of the thematic connection between Pesach and Shavuot, right? We know that, Pesach we got out of Mitzrayim, and we count towards Matan Torah at Chag Shavuot. And that's the historical reality of the holidays. But most holidays have two different parts to them. There's the historical reality, and then there's the agricultural reality. And here the Ramban is going to identify for us something really, really significant. Says the Pasuk in this week's Parsha, Perek Chav Gimel Pasuk Yud Zayin, it's the middle of Sefirat HaOmer and Chag Shavuot, but it just identifies the point. Mimoshvotechem taviu lechem tenufa. You have to bring special bread. Shtayim shnei esonim solatien chametz teafenu bikurim lashem. Okay, they are 2 loaves of bread. Avi kraftem alechem, etc., etc. But what is the point of the mimoshvotechem taviu lechem tenufa shtayim shnei esonim solatien chametz teafenu? Wow, that's really interesting. The Shtei Alechem for Shavuot have to be Chametz, and obviously we know that Chametz is Asur on Pesach. And that gets the Ramban thinking, and if you go to Pasuk Yud Zayin, it says the Ramban, Tziva HaKatuv Shetihiyena Chametz. Right, the Ramban says, no, this is a big Chiddush, that there's supposed to be Chametz. Why is it a big Chiddush? Because if you go back to Parshas Vayikra, one of the rules of the Mizbeach is it's also to bring chametz on the mizbeach, and all of a sudden we have a mitzvah of shtei alechem on Shavuot of dafka bringing chametz. So how does that work? So the Ramban recognizes that this is a bit of a chiddush. So he says tziva katuv shetiena chametz lefi shehem toda laHashem. It's a karban toda, and we need to be grateful to Hashem. Ki chukot katzir shamar lanu, because God protected us. You sort of want to show God what you've gotten out of His beneficence, and the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it rain in the proper time and didn't make it rain on our crops while they were sitting out in the fields. We thank Him with the result of that. The result of that is a karban made of chametz. But there's much more going on here, obviously. The fact that chametz is asur on Pesach and mutter, or not just mutter, and a chiyuv on Shavuos also reminds us of other agricultural things going on. For example, the karban that corresponds to the shtei alechem on Shavuos is the karban HaOmer. That's brought, the first night we start counting, the first night of Chol HaMoed Pesach. That karban is a karban of barley, which normally we refer to as a machal behema. Barley is, it's not a really, really good food for us, but it accomplishes something really significant. What does the karban HaOmer do for us? It's matir chadash bigvulin. It's matir, you and me and everybody else, being able to eat from the new crop. The new crop only becomes mutter, and this is likely the halacha in Chutz La'aretz. That's a big, big machlokes. Many people rely on, individual heterim and rishonim, but lemaisa, the karban HaOmer is matir chadash everywhere in the world except for the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, karbanos mincha, and other flour-related karbanos that we bring, they only become mutter with the karban shtei lechem. Right? There's a connection between the two. For 49 days, we're allowed to eat from the new crop, and the mizbeach kiviyachol is not allowed to eat from the new crop until the karban shtei lechem. So yes, you can look at Yitzias Mitzrayim and our growth, our spiritual growth, our religious growth for 49 days till Matan Torah, till we get to Torah. That is a certain, passage of time. But there's also the growth from barley, from sa'orim, to chita, to wheat. There's the agricultural growth. There's the idea that on Pesach, Chametz is asur, and on Shavuos, Chametz is the mitzvah, right? And the sense you get is that agricultural also there's a process, right? I start out being able to eat only barley. The mizbeach can only receive my barley, but sort of together with my religious growth, together with my spiritual growth, is the agricultural growth. And when Shavuos comes, I can already bring not just the process that was cut off, right? The stuff that we bring on the Mizbeach for Pesach is kosher lePesach. It's obviously not Chametz. It's not matzah, but it's not Chametz, right? The karban HaOmer has to be kosher lePesach. But as we grow and as we develop, right, the halachic definition of matzah is aborted chametz. If I let the process play out, it would have turned into chametz. I stop the process, it becomes matzah. I don't do that with respect to Shavuos. I don't do that with respect to Matan Torah. I grow into my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I grow into this idea that the process doesn't have to be aborted. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, loves me and appreciates me, and the process can play out. Okay, that I think is a significant point. Now, the next point that the Ramban makes, I'm not going to read it inside because it's really Kabbalistic and it's really hard. It won't make much sense, but there's a bit of it that I think I do understand. Says the Ramban, Chametz on some level is an extreme, just like matzah on some level is an extreme. And extremes generally are prohibited on the Mizbeach. That's why Chametz is asur on the Mizbeach. That's why Devash is asur on the Mizbeach. It's too sweet. It's too rich. It's too processed. But says the Ramban, sometimes the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world is by letting extremes offset each other. And our most famous example of that is the Medrash, and we all know it, the Medrash that says, that God created the world b'midas hadin, and it didn't work. Then he created the world b'midas harachamim, and it didn't work. Then he was shitef midat hadin v'midat harachamim together, and that's the world that we live in. And the Ramban says the same thing with respect to the Mizbeach, right? At some point it's only matzah. At some point it's kosher lePesach. Then at some point it grows into chametz. Neither of those extremes, says the Ramban, is correct. When you put both of those extremes together, you get to the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to run the world. You get to a world that's balanced between midat hadin and midat harachamim. You get a world that's balanced between chametz and matzah. You get a world that's balanced between sweetness and salt. And both of those things together work out. And it's a very, very meaningful idea in the Ramban that yes, chametz is not something you bring on the Mizbeach. Dvash is not something you bring on the Mizbeach, except for circumstances in which you want to say, yes, I recognize the other extreme, and I want to balance out each of the two extremes into the type of Judaism that we believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us, and that we can use to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, that's one idea. Next, says the Ramban, in Perek Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Yud Aleph, I'll just read it to you so we'll get our bearings. Says the Torah, in the discussion of Sefirat HaOmer, Ve'henifet HaOmer lifnei Hashem lirtzonchem mimacharat haShabbat yinifenu haKohen. And I'm sure you're aware that the mimacharat haShabbat, was an enormous fight between us and the Tzdukim, between us and the Baitusim. Is Machras HaShabbos, as they claim, incorrectly obviously, but as they claim, is it Sunday? And Shavuos always falls out on Sunday. And to be honest with you, linguistically, they have a point. Mimacharat HaShabbat does sound like if I said it to you just while we were talking, you would say to myself, okay, Macharat HaShabbat means the day after Shabbos. But it doesn't work here. And I find it fascinating. It was really an emotional issue in the Gemara because the fight was still going on till we won. But the Ramban talks about it, and the sense you get, he feels it as if the fight is still ongoing. Says the Ramban, so first he quotes Rashi. Mimacharat Yom Tov Harishon Shel Pesach. Okay, obviously it doesn't mean Shabbos, it means Pesach. Shimato Omer Shabbat Breshit, Iyata Yodeh Ezahu. Lashon Rashi, right? If you say that Mimacharat Shabbat means the day after Shabbos, so which Shabbos is it? And says the Ramban, again, he completely agrees with Rashi. It's just why it's so fascinating that he talks about it anyway. He says, "Ubemet shezo gidola shebirayot b'Gemara." If you look in the Gemara in Menachos, you'll see all these proofs that the tzdukim are wrong. Obviously, we wrote the Gemara, but so what? All these proofs that the tzdukim are wrong. Some of them are more compelling than others. Says the Ramban, when you look in the Gemara, this is the winning argument. It's not really the winning argument in the Gemara, but says the Ramban, conceptually, intellectually, it's the winning argument. Why? Ki ma ta'am sheyomar hakatuv ki tavo el haaretz uksartem et kitzira. Why would the Torah say, okay, when you come into the land of Israel and you do the first harvest, taviu HaOmer mimacharat Shabbat bereshit. You should bring the karban HaOmer on the first Sunday. Ki yesh b'mashma shebe'ezeh zman min hashana shenavo la'aretz v'niktzor kitzirat. Sounds like, says the Ramban, whenever we get to the land and we do the first harvest, yanif hakohen HaOmer mimacharat haShabbat harishona. Right? The Kohen on the first Motzei Shabbos, the first Saturday night, takes the harvest and he waves it. Shetiyah acharei bi'ateinu la'aretz, whenever it is that we came into the land. V'hinei, says Ramban, ein l'chag haShavuot zman sheyimne mimena. Yes, I understand that unlike other holidays, Shavuot doesn't have an actual date. Shavuot is 50 days after we start counting the Omer. But says the Ramban, for a yontif to be a yontif in the Torah, there has to be a way to calculate the date. You have to tell me when to count from. You can't just tell me, oh, you should count from the Motzei Shabbos of the first Shabbos after we harvested. Doesn't work, says Ramban. V'od, al derech hazeh, lo neida b'shanim habaot acharei kein, matai nuchal lispor, matai nachel lispor, rak miyom hachel chermesh b'akama, kifi ritzonenu. Will always be this confusion. How will we know when to start counting? Ve'ela divrei tohu. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. It can't be. Aval, says the Ramban. Im yihiyeh mimacharat haShabbat yom tov. If it turns out that macharat haShabbat doesn't refer to a regular Shabbos, it refers to a chag. It refers to chag haPesach, which in context it does. Kifi kabbalat rabotenu. Yavo ha'inyan kahogen, then everything works out. Ki tziva ha'katuv tchila shena'aseh b'chodesh harishon chag ha'matzot shivat yamim. Because originally the pasuk says, okay, make yontif of Pesach for a week. Uvayom harishon shabbaton, uvayom hashvi'i shabbaton. Right? So in the pasuk, the Torah does describe Pesach as Shabbaton. Yes, generally speaking, we think of the word Shabbos as referring to, Saturdays, not referring to Pesach. But that's the pasuk. V'chol melechet avodah lo naaseh. It's also to do melacha. V'achar kach amar, ki ka'asher navo el haaretz, navi mimacharat haShabbat hazot, hanizkeret omer hatanufa, v'hi haShabbat harishona hanizkeret kan. So says the Ramban, yes. It is a little confusing in the psukim, but the fact of the matter is, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to count the Omer from the first Saturday night after we enter Eretz Yisrael, because there's no date. I don't need a date for Shavuos if I have a date for Pesach, or not for Pesach naturally, but if I have a date for counting the Omer. So if the Omer comes always the night after the Chag HaPesach, which is in fact referred to in the Pasuk as Shabbaton, so it makes sense. Mima'acharat HaShabbat, I count from the day after Pesach, which is what we do, and the 50th day is Shavuos. But if, as the Baitusim claim, it's the Sunday, there's no way to identify that Sunday, says the Ramban, it can't be. I agree with Rashi. This is a compelling proof. This is a winning proof, and they are wrong. And obviously, the halacha is, according to us, the Prushim, not according to the Tzdukim/Baitusim. And this was, such an emotional machlokes in the Gemara, and such an emotional machlokes during the time of the people who lived there, that I think even the Ramban feels the victory that we had over them in establishing our calendar. And again, not that the Ramban needs to do this, but the Ramban is tying Chag HaShavuot to Chag HaPesach through Sefirat HaOmer. And if we're going to start, right, oftentimes, we start counting the Omer, we don't realize the significance. Counting the Omer gets us to Shavuos, right? The same thing we said before. They're really, really connected in a way that, I don't think that we think about enough, that we value enough. It's not just that it's the 50th day. They're connected in all other kinds of ways. Here's a way that they're connected. Next Ramban. Pasuk Tezvav. Says the Pasuk, Usfartem lachem, right? Our source for Sefirat HaOmer. Usfartem lachem mimacharat HaShabbat miyom haviachem et Omer atunufa sheva Shabbatot timimot tihiyana. Now here, the underlying issue the Ramban is dealing with is something we never think about, but I think we should. Says the Ramban, Usfartem lachem, plural, kimo ulekachtem lachem. What's ulekachtem lachem? That's a reference to the Daled Minim. Ulekachtem lachem bayom orishon, pre-eitz hadar, kapot marim, va'anaf eitz avos, va'ar ve'nachal, usmach. Okay, that's the pasuk. So what does the Ramban mean that ulekachtem lachem like, usfartem lachem like ulekachtem lachem? So he says, Shetehei sfira ulekicha lechal echad ve'echad. Right? I never said to myself, well, I'm not going to get a lulav this year. Bezdin's going to take the Daled Minim for me. No. The plural of ulekachtem lachem means lekicha lechal echad ve'echad. Bezdin can't be motzi me in this mitzvah. So just like Bezdin can't be motzi me in the mitzvah of taking the Daled Minim, says the Ramban, Bezdin can't be motzi me in the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. Okay, now, why is this a chiddush, even though we grew up knowing this? Why would you think it would be otherwise? So he says, Sheyimne befiv v'yazkir cheshbono, we have a mitzvah to announce the day and say what day it is, kasher kiblu rabotenu. He says, ve'ein kain, however, there are other situations in which this is not the case. Ve'ein kain v'safarlo, or v'safralo, right? The psukim about zav and zava. The Torah there says you have to count. Now there it says it in the singular, v'safar and v'safra, dezavin. So it says Ramban, but they're not mitzvos. They're not obligatory. Why? Sheharei imratzu omdim bitumatam. You don't have to go to mikvah, says the Ramban. It's not mandatory. We sometimes forget this. For Kohanim, it's also to be tameh. For Yisraelim, it's not. If I want to remain a zav, if my wife wants to remain a zava, she can. Okay, if you want to become tahor, you have to count. But says the Ramban, even there, the count is not really a count. Ela shalosh kechuhu. I have to be aware of what day it is. Because if I have a re'iyah, if I have a bodily emission, it's going to mess up the days, and I can't go to mikvah. So I have to know what day it is, but that's all. V'chein v'safarta lecha diyovel. Now it gets more complicated. It says the Ramban the same thing in the singular when the Torah says v'safarta lecha, when it's talking about counting to 50, not for Shavuos, but counting to 50 years for Yovel, which is obviously, a huge parallel. Shetizaher b'mispar shelo tishkach. So says Ramban, there is no mitzvah of counting to Yovel. Rather, I just have to be aware of the year. Now, why is it in the singular? So he says in the Midrash, in the Vayikra, not Vayikra Rabbah, in Torah's Kohanim, v'safar talacha bebezdin. It's singular because it's not really my mitzvah to remember what year it is of Yovel. And to be honest with you, I don't know what year it is of Yovel. I don't know that anybody really keeps track nowadays. It'd be interesting to know. There's a machlokes in terms of what the right year is. He says, "V'lo yadati im lomar sheyeh bezdin hagadol chayavim lispor shanim v'shavuot b'rosh kol shana." He said, I don't know whether Bezdin in Yerushalayim is supposed to count. This is year 32 in the count towards Yovel. Ulevarech aleno, to make a bracha, k'mo shenase b'sfiras HaOmer. O lomar sheyizaru Bezdin b'minyan v'yikatshu shnat hachamishim. Right? Does Bezdin make Yovel Yovel? Or does it become Yovel because it's the 50th year? Now the Ramban says the obvious thing, even if we don't understand it. V'hinei mispar hayamim miyom hatinufa ad yom mikra kodesh. The count from the day after Pesach, miyom haviachem et omer hatinufa, until Shavuos, kim mispar hashanim mishnot hashmita ad Yovel. They're exactly the same as counting years. It actually is, right? I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is a holy year, is Shemitah, like a Shabbos, and then it goes on. Va'atam bohem echad, says the Ramban, the reason is the same for each one. But he doesn't say what the reason is. Al kain tisperu chamishim yom, sheyispor sheva shabatot tesha va'arbaim yom, v'yikadesh yom ha'chamishim hanispar biyado, kimo shomar biyovel. The Ramban says it's exactly the same thing. I count to 50, and 50 is Shavuos. I count to 50 by years, and 50 is Yovel. And the sevens, and it works exactly the same. And says the Ramban, there's the same reason for both. Now, obviously, 50 is a significant number in the world, and Kabbalistically and otherwise, the Ramban thinks the world lasts for 50,000 years. It's hard to know exactly. I'm not going to even make an effort to explain that. But the Ramban says that when we count Sefira from Pesach to Shavuos, we should be aware that it's exactly identical to when Bezdin counts to 50 years of Yovel. There's a parallel, there's a deep identity between Shavuos and Yovel. And what that is, I think is certainly beyond me, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. Now, one last Ramban, which is kind of going to bring this point home, is Pasuk Lamed Vav. It's not a Pasuk about Shemitah and Yovel and Shavuos, but it contains a significant idea of the Ramban in terms of a relationship between the two holidays. I'm picking up in the middle of Lamed Vav. It's all Kabbalistic, but I think this point we could get through. V'hinei, says the Ramban, Yom Shmini Atzereti, the 8th day of Chag HaSukkot, is a separate holiday called Shmini Atzeret, Ki Sham Ne'etzar Hakol, because that's when everything stopped. Now, here's the Chiddush. V'tziva b'Chag HaMatzot Shiva Yamim B'Kedusha Lifnehem V'Achreihem. We are commanded, with respect to Chag HaMatzos, Pesach, to have 7 days before and 7 days after. Ki Kulam Kiddoshim Uv'tocham Hashem. Umana mimenu tisha v'arba'im yom shiva shavuot kimei olam. Maybe this is what the Ramban meant in the other Ramban. Then we count 7 times 7, 49 days, 7 full weeks, like the world, like the cycle of the world. I'm looking quickly at the footnote, kimei olam, k'moshnama biyovel. Okay. V'kadesh yom shmini kishmini shel chag. Here's the Chiddush, says the Ramban. Shavuos, at its core, is not a separate holiday from Pesach. Shavuos, at its core, is the culmination of Pesach. It's the 8th day of Pesach. What makes it the 8th day? It's the day after 7 times 7. Right? Literally, it's not the 8th day, but it's parallel to what we call Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres literally is the 8th day of Sukkot, although it's not really Sukkot, it's a separate yontif called Shmini Atzeres. Says the Ramban, Pesach and Shavuos have that same relationship. What we think of as a separate holiday of Shavuot, says the Ramban, is nothing less and nothing more than the 8th day or the last day of Pesach. Yes, it's not literally the 8th day of Pesach, but it's the day that comes after I counted 7 times 7 weeks. That makes it the 8th day. And what does that mean? V'hayamim hasfurim beintayim kecholo shel moed bein harishon v'hashmini b'chag. Says the Ramban, Shavuot has a yantif, it has chol moed, then it has Shmini Atzeret. He says same thing for Pesach. Pesach has a yantif, then it has this period of time, 7 times 7, Sefirat HaOmer. Then the 8th day, the last day of Pesach, is Atzeret. And the Ramban says that's probably why they call it Atzeret. V'hu yom matan Torah she'aram bo et Yishua agdolo dvarav shemun mitoch ha'esh v'lachein yikra'u Chazal b'chol makom Chag HaShavuot Atzeret ki hu biyom shmini shel Chag she'kra'u ha'katuv kein. Because literally, says the Ramban, it's the last day of Pesach. And now it makes complete sense what the Ramban has been saying all along in different forms, right? Not just religiously, not just spiritually, not just agriculturally. Shavuot is the last day of Pesach. And when you look at Pesach and you look at the Haggadah and you add all these questions about storytelling and when the story begins and when the story ends, right? We feel it all the time. When you're at the Seder, it's true. You're aware of the fact that 7 weeks later, we're going to get the Torah. We don't just feel like we left Mitzrayim. We feel like we're going to go through Yam Suf. We're going to stand at Har Sinai, right? One of the Sheish Zechirot of the Ramban is to feel every day as if you literally, or we literally stood at Har Sinai. And the Ramban says that's buried in the story of Mitzrayim, even though you have to wait till you get to Shavuos. But Ad Kidei Kach, says the Ramban, it's the same holiday. And the days in between, and it's a problem for us because for whatever reason, we think of Sefirat as being a sad period of time. Nobody thinks of Chol Hamoed as being a sad period of time. The Ramban knew all about the Talmid of Rabbi Akiva, sadly. But he says the days in between are Kecholo Shel Moed. It's like we're counting from one holiday to the next. They're connected. They're one. And in a strange way, it's strange. They're not really Shalosh Regalim, says the Ramban. There's really 2 Regalim. There's Sukkos, which has an extra holiday of Shmini Atzeres, and there's Pesach that has an extra holiday of Matan Torah, of Shavuos, which is really the culmination of Pesach. And it could be, look, Lamaisa, it was too hard. It would be too hard to have a Seder and talk about Kriyas Yam Suf and talk about Matan Torah. That's just much too much. So we cut it off at Yetzias Mitzrayim. We cut it off the next day as if we're standing in the desert. 7 days later, on Shvi Shel Pesach, we get to Kriyas Yam Suf, which was 7 days after Yam Suf. And then 6 weeks later, we get to the next stage in the story, but they're all connected. They're connected deeply. They're connected in all the ways that they can be connected. And that's why, to go back to the first Ramban we did, maybe the Karban HaOmer has to be kosher lePesach, sort of like matzah. And the Shtei Alechem is the exact opposite. Shtei Alechem is the culmination of the process. The process that begins with Pesach, ends with Shavuos, ends with matzah turning into Chametz, ends with the rules of the Mizbeach being suspended for purposes of bringing a special Karban Todah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It ends with all the things that we've said. It ends with accounting, with the mitzvah of us to count. It ends with our victory over the Tzedukim, with the proof that Machras HaShabbos can't be Sunday. It must be the day after Pesach. And it ends with this idea in the Ramban. Hayamim hasfrim beintayim heim kecholo shel moed. It's like one Yom Tov that you count from the first day to the last day. That's it for today. Yashkach to everybody. And we'll be back next week for another version of Ramban al HaParsha. Shabbat Shalom.